Okay, the NRL has decided to suspend operations indefinitely. This follows on from the AFL yesterday suspending all league play until the 31st of May. The NRL, however, is in a bit more of a financially precarious position than the AFL. They're more reliant on games being played and ticket revenues and TV viewership than the AFL. The AFL is the wealthier of the two leagues. The NRL is facing up to 500 million Australian dollars in losses. That's around 300 million pounds to UK rugby league fans. I don't know what that is in US dollars, but it's a fair whack of cash. It's not a healthy amount that you can afford to lose. That's if they do not complete the season. If they were allowed to restart the season, which is hypothetical, if they can do it in basically an isolated location where all 16 teams are flown in and they're kept there and they play each other once, they could lose as little as 100 million if they complete the season in some shape or form behind closed doors. We don't know if they're allowed to do that, hence why the indefinite suspension. Now, the NRL and AFL will have to cop some criticism. Why they decided to start their seasons knowing that the viral outbreak was getting worse around the world, the country was going to lockdown. They could have, in theory, I know this wouldn't have been the best rugby league or best Aussie rules, started playing in January when cases were being reported outside of China. They could have actually started league play earlier and got more of their season completed, or delayed the start of the season to allow contingency plans to be put in place to possibly reduce the schedule, start later, because now we do know some of the plans that the NRL have on the table, some of the options, and some of the options are playing September to December and getting State of Origin done around New Year's, which could work. It wouldn't be perfect conditions because it would be technically the height of Australian summer, but it is doable to minimise financial losses. So putting down indefinitely is a bit of genius on Todd Greenberg's part. It's allowing more flexibility. The issue is, however, while they're not playing, they're losing money, and playing the second round behind closed doors costs them money as well. And it's something that is going to affect the NRL long term. We don't know if the NRL is actually going to survive this pandemic financially. Australia may actually come out of this pandemic rather well with not as many cases as other countries, and if they follow the lockdown procedures, and New Zealand as well, they may come out health-wise relatively well, but financially the NRL will be hammered if they can't get more games played at some point. If they can play games in let's say Central Queensland where they plan to possibly as a contingency, they will lose less money, and they can sort of get by next season. It will affect the salary cap, of course. If they can't get games played until very late on in the year, they're going to face up to 500 million Australian dollars in losses, which I don't think the NRL can survive. The AFL, on the other hand, has more financial reserves. It's the bigger league. It has more teams. It has more fans. But even so, the AFL will also take a financial hit, which will affect the salary cap going forward. But they've allowed themselves less wiggle room by putting down a provisional date where they want to start playing again, which is in 6 weeks. The NRL have been a bit smart in allowing flexibility with an indefinite suspension. The AFL, not so much. But both leagues will have to have questions pointed at them, and both CEOs, McLaughlin and Greenberg, about allowing their seasons to start at this point, knowing that we've had 3 months of pandemic around the world. They could have possibly started in January when the first cases were reported outside of China and got some of the league play done, a good 3 months worth actually, which would have been put the NRL and AFL in a far better position to survive this suspension of play. Yes, the pre-season would have had to be drastically shortened, and the early rounds would probably be not as great as a spectacle with players not being up to match speed. But it would have allowed the NRL and AFL to make some revenues, get some financial buffer in place, or they could have started the seasons later, had a truncated season, reduced the fixtures, we only play each other once rather than home and away, get rid of the bye rounds in the NRL, and reduce State of Origin possibly to a one-off game rather than a 3-game series. They haven't allowed themselves that flexibility as much as they could have, which has put them in this awkward position. Yes, the NRL and Todd Greenberg have done the right thing, and the Australian Rugby League Commission as well, being the overall governing body of the whole sport around Australia. But they are in a tight spot because the Australian and New Zealand governments are restricting travel. They're putting lockdown measures in place. So if they are able to come to some kind of compromise where they do play in a location, it will have to be a single town or city stadium. And the players would have to be in complete lockdown outside of training and play. As soon as a player or a coaching staff tests positive, then the plan would fall apart. It's a plan that works well as long as the players know to self-isolate when they're not playing and training. And that's a problem because we've seen over the last couple of weeks when these measures have been brought in around the world, the younger generation, which is what these players are, they're in their teens to 30s, are not doing the self-isolation or social distancing very, very well. They're not an essential service, so if they are just going to work, go home, they're not doing that social isolation very well. We saw at Bondi Beach, for example, in the news. If you watch the news, it was packed the weekend. We've seen over here in the UK, West Wittering Beach, another famous beach, over in the UK and Brighton Beach in the UK, packed at the weekend. We've had some good weather. That's not social distancing and reducing large crowds. That's hundreds, if not thousands, of people mingling, spreading the virus. Real irresponsible. So that's a problem that the NRL have, is the players actually self-isolating effectively. Also, the New Zealand Warriors, they're based in New Zealand. If they are to play, hypothetically, these games behind closed doors as a contingency plan in somewhere in Queensland or central New South Wales, for example, or Victoria or Western Australia, wherever they find a location, this means the New Zealand Warriors players are going to be away from home for lengthy periods of time. And when they do enter Australia or leave Australia back to New Zealand, they would have to stay in quarantine for 2 weeks minimum. So there's that logistical nightmare as well to deal with. But the NRL, I'm assuming, will be talking with state and territory governments in Australia and also government in New Zealand as well. I'm going to leave that there. We don't know when the NRL are going to get back to playing. They are going to lose a lot of money. It just depends how much and how many games they can get played will affect how much money they lose. But with the NRL now suspending play and the A-League not far behind, I can't see how the Olympics can go ahead. But I've got a video coming up on that, about the Canadians and Australians not allowing their athletes to go, which is putting pressure on the IRC to postpone. And we'll see what happens with that, considering that the Canadian Olympic Association and the Australian Olympic Association said, while the Olympics, as it is currently standing on these dates, with no mention by the IOC of postponement, we're not sending our athletes unless the IOC make a decision on postponing. So that's something to follow as well. Thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts below, and I'll have some more videos on this topic and other topics for you very, very soon.